I want to tell you something before we get into this. Before the maps, before the treaties, before the Galactic Accord made everything neat and official, and stamped with 17 different seals from 17 different civilizations, before all of that, there was a fear. Not the kind of fear you feel when a sun goes supernova. Not the kind of fear you feel when a black hole is pulling your ship apart at the seams. Those are big fears, yes. Those are fears that make entire species rethink their survival strategies. Those are fears that reshape civilizations. No, the fear I'm talking about was quieter than that. It was the kind of fear that a seasoned warrior carries in his chest on a Tuesday morning. The kind of fear that doesn't shout at you. It just sits there behind your sternum, behind your ribs, behind 3 layers of whatever armor you're wearing, and it hums. Low, constant, patient. It was the fear of humans. And I know what you're thinking. I know exactly what you're thinking because I thought it too the first time I heard someone say it out loud. I thought, these people are small. I thought, these people are fragile. I thought, these people bleed when you scratch them. I'd seen the medical reports. I'd seen the comparative biological assessments. I'd seen the size charts and the strength charts and the endurance projections, and I'd compared them to every other species that had ever joined the galactic community. And the numbers said, clearly, empirically, without any room for misinterpretation, that humans were somewhere in the lower middle of the pack. Average height, average strength, average reflexes, below average sensory capabilities in almost every measurable category. Their hearing was weak. Their smell was almost non-existent by interstellar standards. Their eyes could only process a laughably narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. They couldn't breathe methane. They couldn't survive the pressure on water worlds. Their bones broke. Their skin tore. They got infections from microscopic organisms and needed to sleep for a third of every day cycle, or they started making catastrophically bad decisions. On paper, humans were underwhelming. On paper. But there's a reason the Korath Empire, the most feared military force in 4 sectors for 1,100 years, had a standing military protocol that specifically named humans as priority Class 1 threats. There's a reason the Vale Collective, who had never agreed on anything in their 800 years of multi-species governance, unanimously and immediately voted to classify human military engagement as a Category 7 situation requiring full council authorization before any field commander could authorize direct conflict. There's a reason that the Datu warrior caste, who had a tradition going back 4,000 years of tattooing their kills onto their chest plates, had a special mark, not a kill mark, but a survival mark, that you earn not by killing a human, but by surviving a serious engagement with one. Let me say that again. The Datu didn't give you honor for killing a human. They gave you honor for walking away. That should tell you something. That should tell you everything. My name is Korval Theshamaret. I was a field archivist with the Galactic Historical Corps for 31 years before my legs gave out, and my superiors decided I was more useful cataloging testimony than gathering it. I've interviewed 3,417 individuals from 62 different species across 9 sectors. Warriors, politicians, scientists, civilians, refugees, survivors, victors, and people who had lost things that didn't have names yet. And in all of that, in 3 decades of listening to the galaxy tell its own story, the subject that came up more consistently, more emotionally, more urgently than almost anything else was humans. Specifically, what it was like to fight them. Or more accurately, what it was like to try. This is a compilation of those testimonies. This is the story of the species that every warrior in the known galaxy learned to fear, not because of what the data said, but because of what the data couldn't capture. What the charts couldn't measure, what the projections couldn't predict. This is the story of what humans actually are. Document 2, First Contact from the Other Side. Personal testimony of Commander Ves Harkentrayala, Korath Empire, 3rd Expansion Fleet, retired. Recorded Galactic Standard Year 4409. Translated from Korath Prime dialect. You want to know the first thing I noticed about them? Not the weapons, not the ships. The ships were actually, look, I'll be honest, the ships were not impressive at first, not the early ones. The early human ships looked like someone had given a construction project to a species that had never seen space before and told them to do their best. Angular in all the wrong places, inefficient fuel consumption. Navigation systems that, and I say this with retrospective respect because obviously they figured it out. Navigation systems that were doing things in 11 steps that any Korath pilot would have done in 3. No, the first thing I noticed about them was something smaller. We'd intercepted one of their vessels near the Cassir boundary. Routine patrol. Standard boarding procedure. My boarding team was 9 soldiers, 9 Korath soldiers, mind you, which means 9 individuals averaging 2.3 meters in height, with reinforced skeletal structures and combat reflexes that had been honed by 4 centuries of continuous military culture. We cut through their hull at a junction point, clean breach. We came through in formation. And on the other side of that breach, waiting for us, already in position, were 4 humans. 4 against 9. Now my first instinct, and I am not proud of this because I was a professional military officer and I should have read the situation better, my first instinct was relief. I thought, 4 against 9 of us. This will be contained. What I had not yet learned was that the number of humans in the room has almost no predictive value for what is about to happen. The engagement lasted 42 seconds. I know because the suit recorder was running, and I reviewed the footage approximately 900 times afterward, which is how it felt anyway. In 42 seconds, 3 of my soldiers were down, not dead, but down, which with Korath soldiers means something significant had gone wrong with their structural integrity, because Korath soldiers don't fall down easily. 2 more were dealing with situations that I would describe as complications. The remaining 4, myself included, were reassessing the strategic landscape in real time. The 4 humans, meanwhile, were not breathing hard. One of them, a female, average human height, wearing what I later learned was not even their standard combat armor but a modified work suit. One of them looked at me across the corridor and said something. My translator took a moment to catch up. She said, "You want to try the next hallway or are we done?" Just like that. Not aggressive. Not triumphant. Just asking. Like she was genuinely curious whether we wanted to continue or whether we'd prefer to de-escalate. I've thought about that moment every day for 19 years. The thing that broke the Korath military doctrine, and I say this as someone who helped write 3 chapters of that doctrine, was not that humans were stronger than us. They weren't, not in the ways we measured strength. It was that everything about how they processed a combat situation was different from any species we'd encountered. We fought according to optimization. Korath military theory is built on efficiency, the most effective application of force to produce the desired outcome with minimum expenditure of resources. We were very, very good at this. 4 centuries of refinement. It worked against everyone we'd ever fought. Humans didn't optimize. They adapted. In the middle of the engagement, in real time. Not after the situation stabilized, not during a tactical pause, but while things were still moving, while variables were still changing, while the scenario was actively falling apart around them. They were already doing something different than what they'd been doing 10 seconds ago. It was disorienting in a way I cannot fully communicate. Fighting a human in close quarters felt like fighting water. Not because they were fluid or graceful, sometimes they were quite the opposite. Sometimes they were almost ugly in how they moved, inelegant, improvised, but because you couldn't predict the shape they were going to take. You couldn't model what they would do next based on what they'd just done, because they were already changing. I have spoken with warriors from 8 other species who had similar experiences. Every single one of them describes the same thing. The feeling of fighting someone who is simultaneously processing the past, present, and future of the engagement, and selecting from options that you haven't even generated yet. The female soldier, I learned later her name was Sergeant Ana Carvalho. She told me, years afterward through a translator at a conference about interspecies military doctrine. We're not really thinking about what we're doing. That's the thing. If you're thinking, you're too slow. We just do, and the thinking catches up. I'm still not sure if that's comforting or terrifying. I think it's both. Document 3. The DHAATU speak. Compiled testimony from the Dadu Warrior Council, given during the treaty negotiations of Galactic Standard Year 4389. Portions previously classified, declassified by order of the Accord Council, Year 4405. Translated from Dadu War tongue. The Dadu do not speak easily of defeat. This is important context. The Dadu are not a species that processes loss comfortably. Their cultural framework does not have a well-developed vocabulary for it, which tells you something about how infrequently they've had to use one. For 4,000 years, the Dadu were the dominant military culture in their sector, not the largest species, not the most technologically advanced, but the most consistently victorious, because Dadu warriors are trained from the age of 3 in combat disciplines. By the time a Dadu soldier enters active service, they have spent more hours in combat training than most species spend on any single life skill. Their bodies are optimized for violence in ways that make the biological engineering of other species look casual. And then they met humans. What follows is the testimony of Elder War Speaker Dratha Kamavaren, given to the Negotiation Council. Dratha commanded the Dadu forces during the Outer Reach incident of GSY 4381, which represented the most significant defeat in 800 years of Dadu military history. The Elder War Speaker speaks. I will tell you what I told my warriors afterward, because it is the only honest account I can give. We did not lose because we were outgunned. We had superior numbers and superior individual combat capability and superior tactical formation experience. By every measure that we use to predict engagement outcomes, we should have won. We lost because of something we did not have a word for. In Dadu war tongue, there is no word for what humans do in the moment when everything is going wrong. We have words for bravery. We have words for tactical adjustment. We have words for sacrifice. We have words for desperation. We did not have a word for what we saw in that engagement, so afterward we made one. The word is Verath. It roughly translates as, the state of becoming more dangerous as conditions worsen. Every warrior species in the galaxy, when things go badly, follows one of two paths. They either withdraw, tactical retreat, resource preservation, live to fight another day, or they escalate, increase aggression, commit more force, push through. Humans do neither. When things go badly for a human in combat, something changes in them that is not tactical. It is not a decision, or if it is a decision, it happens somewhere below the level of conscious thought. They become something different. They become Verath. We first observed it in the second hour of the engagement, when our numbers had reduced their initial force by roughly 40%. By any calculation, this should have been the breaking point. This was past the casualty threshold where every other species we had ever fought began to show behavioral changes consistent with recognition of defeat, communication breakdowns, formation degradation, individual actors beginning to prioritize self-preservation over mission execution. The humans instead became harder to kill. I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean it literally. The humans we were fighting in the second hour were physically more dangerous than the humans we had been fighting in the first hour. They were taking damage that should have been slowing them down, and they were not slowing down. They were in positions of numerical disadvantage, and they were not behaving as though numerical disadvantage had any meaning. One human, a male, younger than average by the size of him, this one human engaged 3 of my warriors simultaneously in a corridor barely wide enough for 2 people. 3 Dadu warriors. This is not a situation that should have had an outcome favorable to the human. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. Afterward, all 3 of my warriors needed medical attention. The human walked away. We found out later that he had 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist before that engagement began. He knew he was injured. He fought 3 of our people with 2 broken ribs and a broken wrist, and he walked away. That is Verath. After the engagement, I asked for an audience with the human commander. I wanted to understand. I had been fighting wars for 40 years, and I had never not understood what I had fought. I asked him, what happens to your people when things go wrong? What is the process? What is the doctrine? He thought about it for a moment, and then he said something that I have carried with me ever since. He said, we have a concept. It's called the second wind. We don't really know where it comes from. We just know it's there. I have been trying to understand that phrase for 8 years. I am not sure I ever will. But I will tell you this. We added the survival mark to our warrior code after the Outer Reach incident. Not the kill mark, the survival mark. Because walking away from a serious engagement with humans was not a lesser accomplishment than killing something else. It was the greater one. That is all I will say. Document 4, The Science of Fear. Academic paper excerpt, Dr. Yena Sorolax, Professor of Interspecies Conflict Dynamics, Galactic Institute of Strategic Studies. Published GSY 4407, reprinted with permission. The question most frequently posed to me by colleagues, students, and the occasional bewildered military officer seeking consultation is some variation of, why are humans so effective in combat, given their apparent biological limitations? The honest answer, which I have refined over 20 years of research, is, we don't fully know, but we have several very compelling hypotheses. The first and most important has to do with evolutionary pressure. Humans evolved on a planet, they call it Earth, their word for the ground beneath their feet, which I find endearing in a species that now travels between stars. Humans evolved on a planet that was, by galactic standards for inhabited worlds, extremely biologically aggressive. Their planet was not a safe environment. Humans at the early stages of their species' development were not at the top of their food chain. They were prey animals as much as predators. They shared their world with organisms that were faster, stronger, more sensory capable, and specifically designed by evolutionary pressure to hunt and kill things of approximately human size. And humans survived, not by developing biological adaptations that made them formidable in the conventional sense, claws, armor plating, venom, enhanced musculature. Those adaptations existed on their world in other species. Humans took a different path. They adapted cognitively. They developed the capacity to solve problems, to use tools, to coordinate with each other in complex and flexible ways, and critically. And this is the part that has the most implications for the military analysis. They developed the psychological architecture for what we might call sustained engagement under deteriorating conditions. Most prey animals, when faced with a predator, have two primary responses: flight or fight. Humans developed a third response that is rarer in the animal kingdom and almost unique in the sapient species we've cataloged. They developed the capacity to continue fighting past the point where flight becomes impossible and pure fight response becomes insufficient. They developed the capacity to think, to adapt, to cooperate, and to keep going simultaneously in the same cognitive moment. This manifests in combat as what the Datu now call Verath, what human military historians call fighting spirit, what a Korath field officer once described to me, with a particular expression on their face that combined frustration and something very close to respect, as the part where they stop being reasonable. The second hypothesis concerns pain tolerance and pain processing. Comparative analysis of pain response across sapient species shows humans in an unusual position. Their pain threshold is not unusually high. In a simple measurement of pain sensitivity, humans are average to slightly above average in how much stimulus is required before they register pain. But their response to pain is anomalous. In most species, pain serves its evolutionary purpose cleanly. It signals damage, it triggers behavioral change, it reduces engagement in the activity causing the damage. Pain is the body's way of saying stop doing that. In humans, the relationship between pain and behavior is more complicated. Humans can, and often do, continue performing physically demanding and cognitively complex activities while experiencing significant pain. Not because they don't feel it, they do, but they appear to have developed the capacity to partition the pain, to acknowledge it, file it somewhere, and continue operating. Human soldiers in combat have been documented performing tactically sophisticated maneuvers while carrying injuries that would cause complete behavioral shutdown in 7 of the 15 sapient species we have the best comparative data for. There's also the matter of adrenaline, or rather, the human equivalent, a biochemical cascade triggered by high-stress situations that temporarily enhances physical and cognitive performance. Every sapient species has some version of this, but the human version has an unusually wide operating window and a particularly pronounced effect on what might be called damage tolerance. During peak adrenaline response, humans can sustain injuries that would be incapacitating under normal conditions and continue functioning at high effectiveness for meaningful periods of time. The third hypothesis is perhaps the most difficult to quantify, but may be the most significant: human psychology around group identity and collective preservation. Humans are a deeply social species. This is not unusual. Many sapient species are social. But humans have developed a particular relationship with their social groups that has direct combat implications. Specifically, when members of their social group are threatened, human performance in combat does not merely maintain, it escalates. This is not rational, it is not tactical, it is not optimized. A species operating on pure strategic logic would not increase personal risk exposure in response to threats to others, because the calculation of expected outcomes does not improve simply because you are angry or scared for someone you care about. And yet this is consistently what humans do. We have documented cases, not exceptional outlier cases, but typical cases, of individual human soldiers engaging enemy forces, many times their number in situations where the tactical calculus was unambiguously negative, simply because those enemy forces represented a threat to members of their group, and winning. We have documented cases of humans performing physical feats during these moments that are, by every biological model we have for their species, impossible. Weight they should not be able to lift, distances they should not be able to cover, injuries they should not be able to sustain and remain functional. The human body, under sufficient emotional provocation, appears to briefly suspend several of its own limiting mechanisms. I want to be careful about how I characterize this, because it is easy to romanticize, and the scientific reality is both more interesting and more strange than the romantic version. Humans are not magic. They are not supernatural. What they are is a species that evolved in conditions severe enough that their psychology developed a contingency mode, something like an emergency override, that activates when normal parameters are insufficient. The problem for anyone who finds themselves in conflict with humans is that you cannot always predict when the override will activate. You cannot model it cleanly. You cannot use it against them, because it is not triggered by the same things that trigger it in other species. It is triggered by things that are specific to humans, by relationships and commitments, and something that, after 20 years of study, I can only describe as conviction. And when it activates, the humans you thought you understood become something considerably more difficult. I'm not a soldier, I want to get that out front. I'm a freight hauler, have been for 22 years. I carry goods from the core worlds to the outer territories and back. I've seen a lot of things, I've been in a lot of situations. I was docked at Waypoint Station, Nelavar, in the outer territories near what was then still considered contested space, during what I will just call the incident. This was about 5 years ago. I won't be more specific than that for reasons that will be obvious. What I can tell you is what I saw. Nelavar is, or was, they've rebuilt it since Nelavar was one of those stations that's supposed to be neutral territory. Posted neutral, has the certification and everything. Every major polity in that region had signed the neutrality agreement. It was supposed to be safe. The Rukan Syndicate, and I'll name them because they've been named in enough official reports that it's not going to surprise anyone. The Rukan Syndicate had been pressing into the outer territories for about 3 years before this, doing what syndicates do, which is apply pressure to neutral stations to get them to become, let's say, less neutral. Selective taxation, arbitrary inspection fees, the occasional armed visit to remind people of the service they were providing. Nelavar had been resisting, which is brave and also the reason I was docked there, because I preferred stations that weren't syndicate adjacent. On the day of the incident, 3 Rukan enforcement vessels docked and offloaded about 40 armed personnel. Not a huge number by military standards, but more than enough to make a point on a civilian station. There were 6 humans on the station that day. 6. 4 of them were cargo workers. 1 was a mechanic. 1 was a contract mediator who'd been stranded there waiting for a ship out. None of them were military. None of them were armed, at least not with anything they'd brought. A civilian freight station has lockers. It has emergency equipment. It has things that are technically not weapons but can be used as weapons if you're creative. I was in the station's upper observation bay when things went wrong. I had a clear view of the main corridor through the viewport. I wasn't involved. I want to be very clear that I made no heroic decisions that day. I watched from behind viewport glass, and I did not stop breathing for approximately 12 minutes. What I saw was this. The Rukan personnel moved through the station in a standard pressure formation, spread out, covering exits, moving the station staff toward the central hub where they could be contained. It was professional. It was efficient. The Rukan are not amateurs. Somewhere between the docking ring and the central hub, the 6 humans decided they had a different idea about how the afternoon was going to go. I don't know whose idea it was originally. I don't know who spoke first or what was said. By the time I was watching, the decision had already been made. What I saw was a cargo worker, broad human male with the kind of arms you get from 20 years of moving heavy things, step out of a side corridor with what I'm fairly certain was a magnetic coupling tool in his hands, and just engage. Just walked up to 2 Rukan soldiers and started dealing with the situation. The Rukan soldier he hit first went down. The second one tried to bring a weapon up, and the human, still holding the coupling tool, dealt with that too in a way that I don't have clinical vocabulary for. This triggered, obviously, a response. Several Rukan personnel in the corridor turned their attention toward the cargo worker. Which was when the other 5 humans did whatever they had been waiting to do, apparently simultaneously, from 5 different positions in the corridor and the adjacent areas. I'm going to try to describe this accurately without overstating it. It was not clean, it was not elegant, it was not the kind of coordinated operation that military units train for. It was, if I'm being honest, kind of chaotic, and several things happened that I'm sure nobody planned. One of the human cargo workers fell down at one point, and I think the Rukan soldiers thought that was it. He got up. The mechanic, the human mechanic, did things with tools and station infrastructure that I cannot fully explain, but the end result was that the Rukan personnel's communication systems stopped working for critical minutes. G to try, sir, but I want to flag in advance that my explanation is going to sound like I am making excuses, and I want to be clear that I am not. I am describing what happened as accurately as I can. The human contingent at 7-4 numbered 11 individuals. We deployed 132 soldiers. The engagement lasted 94 minutes, which is significantly longer than any model we would have predicted for a 12-to-1 confrontation with this level of human force capability. During that 94 minutes, we sustained casualties in a pattern that the engagement models cannot explain. Our casualties accelerated in the second and third phase of the engagement, despite the fact that our numerical advantage was increasing during those phases, not decreasing. We were taking more casualties, not fewer, as the human numbers fell. I've reviewed the footage of the later engagement phases specifically. The humans who were still in the fight in the third phase, 6 of them against what was then nearly 90 of us, were performing at a level that is not consistent with the biological profiles we have for the species. They were faster. They were more accurate. They were making better tactical decisions, not worse ones, under what should have been overwhelming pressure. The last 3 humans to be neutralized, not killed, because we had standing orders to secure rather than eliminate. Those 3 held a junction in the facility for 40 minutes against concentrated force. 40 minutes, Admiral. They had no particular tactical advantage in that position. They had no special equipment. They were injured. They were outnumbered 27-3. My second officer used a phrase that I haven't been able to get out of my head. He said, "Sir, I think they got angrier," which is not a military analysis I can put in an official report, but I think he was right. I think they got angrier, and I think that made them considerably more dangerous, and I think our models have absolutely no way to account for that. Fleet Admiral Korethvelen. The tactical reasoning is that I don't want my people fighting humans who have additional reasons to be angry. Update the protocol. This exchange was discovered in the Koreth military archives during the post-accord records sharing process. It represents the first known instance of a major galactic military power formally modifying its engagement doctrine to account specifically for human psychological response. The protocol that Fleet Admiral Korethvelen referenced, later formalized as Protocol 7, subsection Gamma, was distributed to all active Koreth commanders within 6 standard days. It was, for 11 years, the most highly classified document in the Koreth military library. When it was declassified as part of the Accord process, the other major military powers of the galactic community read it with great interest. Most of them had already independently arrived at similar conclusions. Several had already written similar protocols. They just hadn't talked about it openly. Document 7, Private Account, a RUKEN soldier speaks. Submitted testimony. Subject requested identity concealment but waived species identification. Rukan Syndicate former enforcement officer, rank, Senior Blade, retired. GSY 4411, recorded and translated. I'm going to tell you something that my former colleagues would probably want me to keep quiet. But I'm retired now, and I've got opinions I've earned the right to have. I was Rukin Syndicate for 17 years. Senior Blade is not a simple rank. You don't get there without having been in a lot of situations, and having made a lot of decisions, and having come out the other side intact. I'm not going to apologize for what I was or what I did because that's a different conversation, and not what you're here for. What you're here for is humans. Fine. I dealt with humans 3 times in my career. The first time early on, I was not the senior officer and I was following orders, and the senior officer in question had not been properly briefed on human engagement, which is something the syndicate was bad at for a while before they got better. That first time I was young, I had the standard assumptions. I thought the numbers said what I thought they said. The numbers did not say what I thought they said. I'm not going to go into detail on that engagement because it's not relevant. What's relevant is that afterward, I made it my personal project to understand what I had seen. Not officially, the syndicate didn't exactly encourage its enforcement officers to become amateur xenobiologists. But personally, I spent years reading everything I could find about humans, everything I could get my hands on that was actually written by people who'd had real engagement experience, not theoretical assessments. And what I found was a pattern. Every single account of serious human engagement had the same shape. There was a phase where the person describing it thought they understood the situation, where the numbers made sense, where the assessment was solid, where they could see the path to the expected outcome. And then there was the moment where the expected outcome stopped being what was happening. And then there was the part where the person describing it was trying, with varying degrees of success, to explain what had happened instead. The explanations varied. Different species, different vocabulary, different analytical frameworks. Some of them were scientific. Some of them were almost mythological. I read some accounts from species that had experienced serious engagements with humans and had concluded, at least initially, that humans had some form of spiritual or supernatural capability. Not because they're superstitious, but because what they witnessed did not fit any natural framework they had. But underneath all the different explanations, the same pattern, always the same moment. The moment where the humans became something other than what the initial assessment had predicted. I call it the switch, not my most sophisticated terminology, I know. But that's what it felt like, from everything I read and from my own limited experience, like a switch flipping. Before the switch, you were dealing with one thing. After the switch, something very different was in the room with you. What flipped the switch varied. Sometimes it was direct threat to the humans' own lives and they'd exhausted flight options. Sometimes it was threat to people they were with. Sometimes it was something that looked like pure principle, like the humans had decided that a line had been crossed, and the line mattered more than the math. That last one is the hardest to plan for. At least threat response has some predictability. You can model threat escalation. You can track when flight becomes impossible. You can roughly estimate when a rational actor will make the shift to full engagement. But principle, how do you model principle? How do you predict in advance which lines a species draws, and more importantly, how do you predict how they'll respond when those lines are crossed? You can't, not reliably. I developed 3 operational rules around human engagement that I shared with every unit I ever commanded in my 17 years. And these rules were not popular with the brass, because they were not aggressive enough for the syndicate's preferred posture. But I will tell you right now that any officer who followed them had a better outcome record than any officer who didn't. Rule 1, do not assume that your numerical advantage is predictive. Rule 2, do not touch their wounded and do not threaten their people. If you do, you have changed the nature of the engagement in ways you cannot fully anticipate. Rule 3, if humans tell you to stop, consider stopping. Seriously consider it. Because if they've said it once, they've done the math, and whatever the math says is what they believe they can back up. That 3rd rule was the one that got me in trouble with the brass. They thought it was soft. They thought it was defeatist. 3 of the officers who ignored that rule are not here anymore to have opinions about whether I was defeatist. Document 8, The Witness at the Edge. Personal narrative, long form. Submitted by Tessellate Voroshan, civilian researcher, species. Vale, academic specialization, Interspecies Conflict History, GSY 4411. I want to tell you about the day I stopped thinking of humans as a subject of study and started thinking of them as something else. I'm not sure I have the right word yet for what the something else is. I was on a research sabbatical, stationed at an observation post near the old border territories. This was during the transition period, after the first major accord negotiations, but before the final ratification, when things were officially peaceful, but there were still, let's say, actors in the region who hadn't fully committed to the spirit of the agreement. The observation post was small, 12 researchers, 3 support staff, 2 security officers. We were there to document territorial transition patterns, not to be involved in anything. We were explicitly non-involved. One evening, we detected a Kethavar raider vessel on approach. Kethavar raiders in that period were opportunistic. They hit poorly defended research stations and transport vessels, took what they could, caused enough damage to discourage pursuit. They were not known for extreme violence, but they were known for being thorough and for not caring particularly much about the well-being of whoever they were raiding. Our security officers were Vale military standard, good officers, professionally trained. But 2 of them against a Kethavar raider crew, which would be 12 to 16 armed individuals at minimum, was not a favorable situation by any definition. There were 2 humans at the post, both researchers. One was an elderly historian named Dr. Mariam Souza, who specialized in early human space exploration documentation. The other was a younger man named Kenji Nakamura, a linguist who had been helping us with translation work. They were researchers. Dr. Souza was 73 years old. Nakamura had never, to my knowledge, been in anything that could be described as a combat situation. When we detected the Kethavar approach, the standard protocol was evacuation to the reinforced section and lockdown, while our security officers managed the situation as best they could. That's what we did. We moved to the reinforced section. Dr. Souza came with us. She was calm in a way that I found striking, not the calm of someone who doesn't understand the situation, but the calm of someone who does understand it and has made their peace with it. She sat down, asked if anyone had tea, and began reviewing her notes. Nakamura did not come with us. I noticed this as we were moving through the corridor. The others were ahead of me, and I turned, and Nakamura was standing at a junction, not moving toward the reinforced section, but looking in the direction of the communications room. I said his name. I asked where he was going. He said, the communications array. If I can get the emergency signal out before they jam it, there's a response station 40 minutes away. That's a situation where we get help, worth trying. I said, and I am not proud of this, but I'm being honest. I said, the communications room doesn't have the same protection as the reinforced section. He looked at me. He was a linguist. He had ink on his hands from taking notes. He had a mild scholarly manner and wore reading glasses, which is a human optical correction device that I have always found endearing. He said, yeah, I know. And he walked toward the communications room. The Kethavar breached our outer hull approximately 9 minutes later. Our security officers managed the initial entry point. It bought time. Nakamura got the signal out. It took him 4 minutes to get the signal out. Afterward, when it was over and help had arrived and the Kethavar had been dealt with, I asked him what those 4 minutes were like. He thought about it for a while. He was sitting with bandaged hands by that point, because the communications equipment had a problem during the process that I won't detail, but that resulted in damage to his hands, and he was sitting looking at the bandages like he was noticing them for the first time. He said, honestly, I wasn't thinking much. I was just doing the next thing, then the next thing, you know how it is. I did not know how it was. I have never known how it was to simply do the next thing when the next thing is occurring in a situation like that one. But I nodded, because what else do you say? Dr. Souza from across the room, without looking up from her notes, said, he does this, don't encourage him. And Nakamura laughed, and I noticed that the laugh caught slightly at the edges, just for a moment, and then it was a real laugh, and he went back to looking at his bandaged hands. I have thought about those 4 minutes many times since. Not about what Nakamura did. I understand the mechanics of what he did, the decision and the execution. What I think about is the texture of it, the matter-of-factness, the next thing, next thing, next thing. There's something in that. Something about how humans relate to moments that are, by objective measure, genuinely dangerous. They don't remove themselves from the danger emotionally in the way that many species do. They don't abstract it. They don't compartmentalize it in advance. They don't apply the detachment protocols that veil military training teaches precisely, because we have learned that detachment is how you function in high-stress situations. Humans stay in it. They stay in the fear and the adrenaline and the physical reality of what's happening, and they operate from inside that state rather than from above it. I don't know if that's braver or if it's something else entirely, something for which I, like the Datu war speaker before me, don't yet have a word. But I think about it. I think about a linguist with ink on his hands saying, "Yeah, I know," and walking down a corridor towards something that most people would have walked away from. And I think the galaxy is stranger and richer for having humans in it, even when it's also considerably more complicated. After 18 months of collaborative intelligence review across 7 member civilizations, the Unified Defense Council presents the following consolidated assessment of human military capability. Finding 1. Standard metrics underpredict performance. Every model currently employed by member civilizations for predicting military engagement outcomes performs poorly when applied to human forces. The models are not wrong about inputs. Human biological parameters, equipment specifications, and tactical training times are correctly measured. The models are wrong about how those inputs translate to outcomes. The consistent pattern across 37 documented engagements reviewed by this council is that humans outperform their projections by a factor that ranges from 1.4 to 4.7, depending on engagement conditions. Notably, the factor is inversely correlated with conditions. That is, humans perform furthest above projection in the worst situations. When conditions deteriorate, human performance relative to projection increases. This is the opposite of what most predictive models are built to expect. Finding 2. Social bond as force multiplier. Human military units demonstrate significant performance increases when operating in defense of or alongside individuals with whom they have established personal relationships. This is distinct from general group cohesion, which all social species demonstrate. Human social bond activation appears to function as a genuine force multiplier, not merely maintaining baseline performance, but exceeding it. Units with longer established relationships demonstrate higher multiplier factors, but even newly formed units show evidence of rapid social bond formation that begins to produce measurable effects within hours. Humans appear to be biologically predisposed to form protective attachments rapidly, and these attachments activate high-performance states. Military forces engaging human units should be advised that threatening or harming individuals under human protection is likely to produce immediate performance escalation in human elements present. This is not a recommendation to exploit that information offensively. Attempts to do so have historically produced negative outcomes, but a warning to operational commanders regarding the risk of inadvertently triggering escalated human response. Finding 3. Psychological irreversibility. Once a human has committed to an engagement, the standard deterrence calculus becomes unreliable. Displays of superior force that would, in the Council's experience with other species, trigger reassessment and withdrawal have inconsistent effects on committed human combatants. In documented cases, superior force display has produced the opposite of deterrence. It has in some cases produced what human military analysts describe as "they won't back down" behavior, characterized by increased commitment to the engagement rather than tactical retreat. This is difficult to model and has significant implications for escalation management. Standard escalation protocols assume that demonstration of sufficient capability will produce rational actor responses. Humans may not produce rational actor responses in high-commitment engagement situations. Finding 4. Adaptability under fire. Human tactical adaptation speed is high by any comparative measure, but becomes extraordinary under high-pressure conditions. Units experiencing tactical disadvantage have been documented making substantive doctrinal changes in the middle of engagements, not variations on existing approaches, but genuinely novel tactical configurations, with sufficient speed to change engagement outcomes. The implications for engagement planning are significant. A plan that is sound at the beginning of a human engagement may be outdated before it is complete. Closing note from Council Chair Soritha Valamander. The Council has spent 18 months reviewing documentation that other civilizations spent years learning firsthand. We have the advantage of learning from their experience. I want to say directly in this record what the data implies but does not state. Humans are not a species to be trifled with. Not because they are the largest, not because they are the most advanced, not because they have the biggest ships or the most powerful weapons, although over time they will likely have all of those things, and that will be its own consideration. But because of what happens when you back them into a corner. What happens in that moment has been documented 37 times in this review. 37 times by observers from a dozen different civilizations, and the accounts are in their essentials the same. You expect one thing, you get something else entirely. Something that doesn't stop. The practical advice is to not create the corner, to not find yourself in the position of having backed them into it. Because whatever comes out of the corner is not something that our models, our training, or our collective experience has given us reliable tools to manage. And nobody, not in this Council's review, not in any of the thousands of accounts we have assessed, nobody has found a good answer for what to do about humans who have decided they're not done yet. Document 10, the final account, what it meant. Personal essay, Korval Theshamarit, Field Archivist, Galactic Historical Corps, written at end of career, GSY 4412. I've been compiling this record for 3 years now. 3 years of listening to warriors and scientists and civilians and bureaucrats and former enemies all tell the same story from different angles. 3 years of watching people from species that are, genuinely, measurably, in many respects, more formidable than humans struggle to find words for what happened when they encountered humans in the moments that matter. I want to end this record with something personal, because I think the personal is the part that all the assessments and protocols and classified briefs miss. I met a human once. Just once briefly at a transit junction in the outer territories. She was a pilot, waiting for a connection like I was. We ended up in the same rest area for about 2 hours. She was small, even by human standards, compact, I think is the word. Dark hair going gray at the edges. Tired in the way people who spend a lot of time in space get tired, a particular quality of exhaustion that sits behind the eyes. We talked the way people do when they're stuck somewhere and there's nothing else to do. She told me about where she'd been flying, about the routes she'd been working. I told her about the archive project. She was curious about it. Genuinely curious, not politely. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers with the specific quality of attention that I have come to think of as a human characteristic, not passive listening, but active, like she was doing something with what I said in real time. At some point I said, with what I hoped was appropriate diplomatic framing, many of the people I've interviewed speak of humans with significant respect. She looked at me with an expression I had trouble reading, a complicated expression, something between amusement and something more serious. She said, "That's a nice word for it." I said, "What word would you use?" She was quiet for a moment. Looking at her coffee, she was drinking coffee, a human beverage they seemed to regard as almost medicinal, which given what I now know about their relationship with sleep deprivation makes sense. She said, "I don't know, we don't think of ourselves the way you seem to think of us. We just do what we have to do. The things people remember us for, those aren't special moments for us. Those are just the moments when we decided we weren't going to give up. That's not extraordinary, that's just us." I said, "Perhaps the extraordinary thing is that you don't find it extraordinary." She thought about that. She said, "Maybe." Then her connection was called, and she picked up her bag, and she said it was nice to talk, and she was gone. Just like that. And I sat there in the transit junction, and I thought, I have spent 30 years collecting testimony about this species. I have read the Korath Protocol 7. I have heard the Dadu War Speaker describe Verath. I have reviewed the classified council brief that 9 of the most powerful military advisors in the galaxy produced after 18 months of analysis. And this woman just told me, in one sentence, what all of that documentation has been trying to capture. Those are just the moments when we decided we weren't going to give up. That's it, that's the whole thing. Every species in the galaxy, when the situation becomes sufficiently terrible, at some point makes a calculation. The calculation looks like this. What is the cost of continuing against the probability of the desired outcome? And when the cost is too high and the probability is too low, the rational actor, any rational actor, by every model we have, by every evolutionary framework we understand, stops. Humans make that calculation too. They just sometimes get a different answer. Not because they're wrong, not because they can't do math, but because somewhere in the calculation, there's a variable that the models don't have a standard notation for. Call it conviction, call it stubbornness, call it the second wind, call it Verath, call it whatever your species has a word for. It's the part where they decide that the cost doesn't matter enough. That the thing they're fighting for, the person behind them, the principle under their feet, the line that they will not move past, that this thing has a value that the math can't reach. And when they decide that, something changes. And when that something changes, every warrior in the galaxy has learned, sometimes firsthand, sometimes from accounts like these, that the wisest policy is to reconsider your position. Not because humans are invincible. They're not, they bleed. They break, they die. They have all the vulnerabilities their biology gives them, and a few extras they've invented through sheer creativity and stubbornness. But because when humans decide they're not done, the only honest thing you can do is take them seriously. The warriors of a dozen civilizations learned this at great cost. The ones who are still around to talk about it learned it thoroughly. And the ones who learned it secondhand, through records like this one, have been spared the specific education of experiencing it directly. I hope they take the lesson. Culture tells stories. This is one of the few things that unites the sapient species of the known galaxy. Not government, not economics, not even the basic mechanics of survival, but story. The need to take something that happened and give it a shape and tell it to someone else in the dark. In the old days, before the treaties, there was a warrior named Veth who had never been afraid of anything. Veth had faced the great beasts of the outer worlds. Veth had fought in 30 battles and come away with 30 victories. Veth's chest plate was covered in kill marks from one side to the other, and everyone in the fleet looked at Veth and thought, that is what a warrior is. One day, Veth's fleet encountered a small ship, a human ship. Veth's captain said, "Small ship, few crew, we will deal with this quickly." Veth said nothing, because in those days, Veth did not know what there was to say about humans. They boarded the human ship. There were 4 humans. Veth's boarding team was 20. 20 to 4, this seemed correct to Veth. This seemed like a problem that was already solved. The engagement that followed was not what Veth expected. Veth's team was trained. Veth's team was experienced. Veth's team had the numbers, the equipment, and the position. The 4 humans had something else. What they had did not have a name in those days. It does now. We call it Verath. But in those days, Veth didn't have the word for it, and so Veth stood in the corridor of a human ship watching 4 people who should by every calculation have been retreating. And instead they were advancing, and Veth, who had 30 victories and a full chest plate, felt something new. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to fear. Something that said, you do not know what this is yet. The engagement ended. Veth's team returned to their ship. Of the 20, 9 had notable injuries. Of the 4 humans, all 4 were still standing. Afterward, Veth went to the captain and said, "I have a question about humans." The captain, who was older and wiser, said, "What is your question?" Veth said, "What do you do when they won't stop?" The captain looked at Veth for a long time. Then the captain said, "You give them a reason to." Veth thought about this for many years. Eventually, Veth decided that what the captain meant was, you find a way to end the situation that doesn't require them to continue. You find a door that isn't locked. You find a solution that isn't through them. Because going through them was not a reliable path. There is a concept in early human military history that I want to introduce to this class, because I think it illuminates something fundamental about how humans approach conflict that we have not traditionally understood. The concept is called holding the line. Humans have been holding lines since before they had spacecraft, since before they had global communication networks, since they were, by their own accounting, still figuring out the fundamentals of organized civilization. Their historical record is full of accounts, true accounts, documented by the humans themselves, of individuals or small groups who stood between a threat and something they valued, and stayed there regardless of what the math said about their probability of success. There is a moment from early human history that I find myself returning to in discussions of what humans are. It is not from any interstellar conflict. It is from a period when humans had not yet left their own planet. 300 human warriors, just 300 chose to stand in a narrow pass against an invading force of many thousands. They were, by every measure, outnumbered beyond reason. They knew they were going to lose. This was not a scenario where they believed they could win in the conventional sense. They stood there anyway. They stood there for 3 days. They stood there because the 3 days mattered, because the 3 days gave something else time to happen, because 300 humans decided that the 3 days were worth the cost, and they paid the cost, and the 3 days happened. I tell this story not because of the battle itself, though the battle is remarkable, but because of what it tells us about the framework humans carry for understanding what they are and what they can do. When a human looks at a situation that appears hopeless, they have a cultural inheritance 300 warriors deep that says, hopeless is not the same as not worth it. When a human decides something is worth it, the situation has changed. That is what the rest of the galaxy keeps discovering. That is what I need you to understand before we discuss the Accord negotiations. Because the Accord negotiations only make sense if you understand that the humans at that table were not operating from the same framework as everyone else in the room. They were not asking whether they could prevail. They already believed they could. The question they were answering was whether prevailing in this particular way was worth the cost. They decided it was. There's a saying among Rukan traders in the outer territories. It goes like this. You can cheat a Korath if you're careful. You can outmaneuver a Vale if you're quick. You can intimidate a Dadu if you have enough people. You can confuse a Kethavar if you know how. Don't push a human. Just don't. Whatever they have in their hand, they'll find a way to make it enough. Whatever they don't have, they'll figure out how to get it or how to do without it. Whatever you're counting on them to do, they'll do something else. Whatever you're counting on them to stop, they'll keep going. Somewhere in their history, somebody dropped them in a situation with no good options, and they came out the other side with something they'd made from nothing. That's just what they do. The parent said, "What makes you ask?" The child said, "The teacher talked about them today, about the accord and the negotiations, and I looked at the pictures of humans and they're so small, they don't look scary." The parent thought for a moment. The parent said, "They're not scary." That's not the right word. The right word is serious. The child said, "What's the difference?" The parent said, "Scary things want to make you afraid. Serious things just are what they are, and the impact is separate from the intention. Humans are very serious. When they commit to something, they mean it. When they say they'll do something, they've already decided they'll do it, and the only question is how. When they say something matters to them, it really does, and they'll show you how much in ways you weren't expecting." The child said, "Is that why all the warriors have the special rules about them?" The parent said, "That's why." The child thought about this. Then the child said, "Can we meet one, a human?" The parent said, "Probably someday. When you do, just be kind to them. You'll find they're kind back. Most of them are in normal times. They're actually quite gentle in normal times." The child said, "But in not normal times. I have 16 weeks with you, and I intend to use them to fundamentally recalibrate how most of you think about threat assessment. Because most of you, I know this, I can tell from the first session, most of you arrived here with models that are at best inadequate and at worst actively dangerous. You have been taught to assess threats in terms of what the threat can do. Firepower, manpower, technology, tactical sophistication, resource availability. These are real factors. I'm not dismissing them. What your previous instruction has underweighted, and what this course will spend considerable time on, is the factor of what the threat will do, specifically, what they will do in the situations that your other models don't handle well. The scenarios that break standard threat assessment models are the interesting ones, not the straightforward engagements. Those are well covered. The interesting scenarios are the ones where the expected inputs stop predicting the expected outputs, where the math stops working. For human forces, the math stops working with remarkable frequency. I want to share something with you from the first week of this course, something I share every year, because I find it is a useful way to frame everything that follows. A colleague of mine, a Korath officer, retired, who shall remain nameless but whose record you would recognize immediately if I told you. This colleague once described to me an engagement with human forces that had gone unexpectedly badly. I asked her, "At what point did you know the models were wrong?" She said, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, "When I realized I was trying to win a negotiation with someone who was no longer negotiating. Someone who had already moved past negotiation to somewhere I didn't have a name for." I find that extraordinarily useful as a frame. There is a space that most species combat psychology occupies during an engagement. It's a continuous process of assessment. Is this working? Is this worth it? What are my options? What is the other party likely to do? This is rational. This is good doctrine. This is how sentient beings who want to survive approach violent conflict. Humans do this too. In normal conditions in the early stages of engagements, they do this like everyone else. But they have a transition point. When they pass through the transition point, and the triggers for the transition vary but will spend 3 sessions on the patterns, when they pass through it, they move into a mode that is no longer continuous assessment. They have done the assessment. The assessment is complete. The outcome of the assessment was, this is worth it. Continue. And then they continue. And the assessment doesn't happen again, not in the same way. You cannot deter a human who has passed the transition point by showing them what it's going to cost them. They know what it's going to cost them. They already decided it was worth it. You cannot discourage them by making things difficult. Difficulty is, for a human past the transition point, more or less irrelevant to the question of whether they continue. You cannot confuse them out of it because the thinking happened before the transition. What's happening now isn't thinking, or it's a different kind of thinking, tactical, immediate, focused, not the kind of thinking that produces withdrawal. The question your threat assessment needs to answer for any engagement involving human forces is, have they passed the transition point, and if so, what caused it? Because if they have, your options simplify dramatically. Option 1, end the situation in a way that gives them what they transitioned for. Whatever they pass the transition point to protect or to achieve, give it to them, or secure it, or make it irrelevant. This is often the most efficient path, and it is the one most frequently not taken because it looks, on paper, like capitulation. It is not capitulation. It is recognizing which battle you're actually in. Option 2, wait. I know that sounds passive. It is the correct answer in more scenarios than you'd expect. Human performance at transition point levels is extraordinary, but it is also metabolically expensive. It cannot be maintained indefinitely. Given time, and this is time measured in hours, occasionally days, not indefinitely. Human physiology will require rest, sustenance, the basic biological maintenance that they cannot entirely override even with all the will in the galaxy. The mistake most forces have made when they chose option 2 was not committing to it. They waited a little, and then they pushed again, and the humans found something else to be angry about and transitioned all over again. Option 2 only works if you're serious about it. Option 3, which I list for completeness rather than recommendation. Press the engagement, accept that you are in an unpredictable situation with high casualty risk, and be prepared for outcomes that your models did not predict. The Council brief from year 4403, which you will all have read before next session, describes 17 engagements in which military forces chose option 3 against committed human elements. I will tell you now what your reading will confirm. The range of outcomes is very wide, and the variance is high, and the average is not favorable to the force pressing against the humans. I'll close this introductory lecture with a question that I want you to sit with until our next meeting. The question is, why does the transition happen? Not what triggers it, we'll cover that in detail. But why? Why do humans have this architecture? Why did this species develop, as a core psychological feature, the capacity to override survival calculus in service of something that isn't immediate survival? I'll give you my answer, which you are welcome to argue with. My answer is, because they needed to. Their history, the history that produced the species, the millions of years of development before they were recognizably what they are now, their history was a gauntlet. a long, sustained, grinding gauntlet of an environment that should have broken them. They were small and soft on a world full of things that were large and hard. They were slow on a world full of things that were fast. They were relatively sensory limited on a world where sensory capability was survival. And they didn't die. Not only did they not die, they thrived. And eventually they started building things and changing things and reaching up toward the sky. And eventually they reached the sky itself. They survived a world that should have killed them by developing the capacity to refuse to be killed. And now that capacity travels with them. Wherever they go, whatever they face, the second wind is there, the Verath is there, the transition point is there. Because they needed it once, and the needing built it into them, and now they carry it everywhere. And the fact that this was never designed, never engineered, never optimized, but rather forged by circumstance over millions of years. That is why no model we have built can fully account for it. You cannot fully model something that wasn't designed. You can only learn to respect it. And that is what we are here to do. See you Thursday. I'm old now and I'm tired, and the archivist who set up this recording is very patient, and I'm going to try to be brief. I've spent almost a decade on this project. I started it when I couldn't walk the field anymore and thought I might as well do something useful from a chair. I'm still in the chair. The project is done, or as done as something like this ever is. What do I want to say at the end of it? I want to say, I think we've been asking the wrong question. For a long time, for as long as the galactic community has been reckoning with humans, the question has been, how do they do it? How do they outperform projections? How do they fight past the point of rational engagement? How does a species that is, in many ways, unremarkable on the standard measures, produce outcomes that the standard measures cannot predict? That's the question that fills the protocols, the question that generated the classified briefs, the question that gave the Datu their survival marks and the Korath their Protocol 7 and the Rukin their informal advisory. Just don't push them. I think that's the wrong question. I think the right question is, what does it say about us? What does it say about the rest of the galaxy that we were all surprised? We had models, we had frameworks, we had centuries of accumulated experience with conflict and capability and what species are and what they can do. And a species that had never left their own planet before started showing up in our documentation as an anomaly that none of our frameworks could contain. We had all this knowledge, and we were still surprised. What surprised us was not that humans were capable. Many species are capable. What surprised us, what the protocols and the briefs and the testimony all circles around without quite landing on, is that humans were capable of something we didn't have a box for. Not more strength, not better technology, not superior tactics exactly. Conviction, the willingness to decide that something matters enough to keep going past the point where keeping going is reasonable. We didn't have a box for that. And I've been sitting with this for 7 years, trying to understand why. I think it's because we all, at some level, assumed that sapient beings who were good enough at reasoning would eventually reason themselves out of unreasonable situations. That intelligence, fully developed, leads to optimization. That sufficiently advanced thinking produces the most rational response to any given situation. Humans broke that assumption. Not because they're irrational. They're not. They're often very clear-eyed about what they're doing and why and what it will cost. They're just not only rational. They have something else alongside the reasoning, something that the reasoning doesn't override, something that sometimes overrides the reasoning. And what I've come to believe, after a decade of listening to every major military power in the known galaxy try to describe what that something is that it's not a design flaw. It's not an evolutionary artifact that will eventually be selected out. It's not a cultural peculiarity that will smooth away as they integrate with the galactic community. It's not something that medicine or policy or enough exposure to other ways of being will change. It is what they are. They are the species that decided that some things are worth more than survival. And we are all, slowly, learning to live in a galaxy with such a species in it. I think we're going to be okay. I think they're going to surprise us again, probably in ways that are good. History suggests that the same architecture that makes humans formidable in conflict makes them remarkable in collaboration, in creativity, in the impulse to reach for something beyond what's already been established.